Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise in me and do powerfully command me, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise in me and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hey, welcome, hello, and welcome, friend. This is the Abracast, and I'm your host, John Towers. We're going to be continuing our bump through The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin here, and the reason is because I have slightly a compulsive personality, and I kind of passed the threshold from dabbling in being a prepper recently, so maybe one of these days I'll take you in and talk about what I've done. But looking back to the point, looking forward, I think in the very near future, we're going to be talking a lot about the Fed, the Federal Reserve. So I wanted to kind of get us ready, get a background on this. In the previous two episodes, the most diabolical duck hunt in history, parts 1 and 2, were sort of the origins of this scam and some of its go-to plays. And now we're going to be jumping forward in the book to a chapter called Fool's Gold, which talks about fractal money, paper money, and it has some good stuff or awful, terrible, horrific things about inflation. So obviously, you know, that's why we're going to be getting into this this chapter. So I'm just going to get right into it. Again, The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin, Chapter 8. Selected readings from Chapter 8, Fool's Gold. In case you're wondering, I do have my weapon of mass distraction, my Jin Jihad, in my vessel of the art here. Keep me sharp. We shall now turn to the remaining two categories, both of which are represented by paper, and which are at the root of almost all of modern man's economic woes. Fiat money. The American Heritage Dictionary defines fiat money as paper money decreed legal tender, not backed by gold or silver. The two characteristics of fiat money, therefore, are 1, it does not represent anything of intrinsic value, and 2, it is decreed legal tender. Legal tender simply means that there is a law requiring everyone to accept the currency in commerce. The two always go together because since the money really is worthless, it soon would be rejected by the public in favor of a more reliable medium of exchange such as gold or silver coin. Thus, when governments issue fiat money, they always declare it to be legal tender under pain of fine or imprisonment. The only way a government can exchange its worthless paper money for tangible goods and services is to give its citizens no choice. The first notable use of this practice was recorded by Marco Polo during his travel to China in the 13th China in the 13th century. The famous explorer gives us this account. The emperor's mint then is in the same city of Cambaluc, and the way it is wrought is such that you might say that he hath the secret of alchemy and perfection, and you would be right. What they take is a certain fine white bast or skin which lies between the wood of the tree and the thick outer bark, and they make it into something resembling sheets of paper, but black. And when these sheets have been prepared, they are cut up into pieces of different sizes. The smallest size is worth a half a tornestle. There is also a kind worth 1 bezant of gold, and another of 3 bezants, and so up to 10. Then these pieces of paper are issued with as much solemnity and authority as if they were pure gold or silver. And on every piece, a variety of officials whose duty it is have to write their names and put their seals. And when all is prepared duly, the chief officer, deputed by Khan, smears the seal entrusted to him with vermilion and impresses it on the paper, so that the form of the seal remains stamped on it in red. The money is then authentic. Anyone forging it would be punished with death, and the Khan causes every year to be made such a vast quantity of this money, which costs him nothing, that it must equal all in the amount all in the treasures of the world. With these pieces of paper made as I have described, he causes all payments on his own account to be made, and then he makes them to pass current universally all over his kingdoms, and nobody, however important he may think himself, dares to refuse them on pain of death, and indeed everybody takes them readily. One is tempted to marvel at the Khan's audacious power and subservience to his subjects who endured such an outrage, but our smugness rapidly vanishes when we consider the similarity to our own Federal Reserve notes. They adorn with signatures and seals. Counterfeiters are severely punished. The government pays its expenses with them. The population is forced to accept them. They and the invisible checkbook money onto which they can be converted are made in such vast quantities that it must be equal to all the treasures in the world, and yet they cost nothing to make. In truth, our present monetary system is an almost exact replica of that which supported the warlords of 7 centuries ago. The colonial experience. Unfortunately, the present situation is not unique to our history. In fact, after China, the next place in the world to adopt the use of fiat money was America, specifically the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this event has been described as not only the origin of paper money in America, but also the British Empire and almost in the Christian world. 1690, Massachusetts launched a military raid against the French colony in Quebec. She had done this before, and each time he had brought back sufficient plunder to more than pay for the expedition. This time, however, the foray was a dismal failure, and the men returned empty-handed. When the soldiers demanded their pay, Massachusetts found its coffers empty. Disgruntled soldiers have a way of becoming unruly, so the officials scrambled for some way to raise the funds. Additional taxes would have been extremely unpopular. So fucking what? Just do it anyways, right? Am I right? So they decided simply to print paper money in order to convince the soldiers and the citizenry to accept it. The governor made 2 solemn promises. It would redeem the paper for gold or silver coin just as soon as there was sufficient tax revenue to do so, and absolutely no paper notes would ever be issued. Absolutely no additional paper notes would ever be issued. Both pledges were promptly broken. Only a few months later, it was announced that the original issue was insufficient to discharge the government's debt, and a new issue almost 6 times greater was put into circulation. This currency wasn't redeemed for nearly 40 years, long after those who had made the pledge had faded from the scene. A classic pattern. Most of the other colonies were quick to learn the magic of the printing press. And the history that followed is a classic example of cause and effect. Governments artificially expended the money supply through the issuance of fiat currency. This was followed by legal tender laws to force its acceptance. Next came the disappearance of gold or silver coins, which went instead to private hoards or to foreign traders who insisted on the real thing for their wares. Many of the colonies repudiated their previous money by issuing new bills that valued multiples of the old. Then came political discontent and civil disobedience. At the end of each cycle was rampant inflation and economic chaos. In 1703, South Carolina declared that its money was a good payment in tender and law, and then added that should anyone refuse to honor it as such, would be fined an amount equal to double the value of the bills so refused. By 1716, the penalty had been increased to threeble the value. The printing press and inflation. Benjamin Franklin was an ardent proponent of fiat money during those years and used his great influence to sell the idea to the public. We can get some idea of the firmament of the times by noting that in 1736, writing in the Pennsylvania Gazette, Franklin apologized for its irregular publication, and it explained that the printer was, quote, with the press laboring for the public good to make money more plentiful, unquote. The printing of money was apparently a major time-consuming operation. In 1737, Massachusetts devalued its fiat money 300%, offering $1 of new currency for 3 of the old. This promise was made that after 5 years, the new money would be fully redeemed in silver or gold, and the promise was not kept. So, as we're hearing more and more about the Fed Digicoin, or whatever the fuck they're going to call it, I want you guys to remember this. They devalued their fiat money by 300% by offering $1 of new currency for 3 of the old. By the late 1750s, Connecticut had price inflated by 800%. The Carolinas had inflated 900%, and Massachusetts 1,000%. Rhode Island 2,300%. Naturally, these inflations all had to come to an end, and when they did, they turned into equally massive deflations and depressions. It has not been shown that even in colonial times, the basic booms and busts, which modern economists are fond of blaming on an unbridled free market, actually were the direct manifestations of the expansion and contraction of fiat money, which was no longer governed by the laws of supply and demand. By this time, coins had completely disappeared from the scene. Some were in private hoards, but most of them had been exported to other countries, leaving the colonies with little choice but to use fiat money or barter. Merchants from abroad were interested in neither of those. However, an international trading ground it to a halt. A blessing in disguise. The experiment with fiat money was a calamity to the colonists, but it was also a thorn in the side of the Bank of England. The bank had used its influence with the crown to forbid the colonies to mint their own coins or to establish local banks. This meant that if the colonists wanted the convenience of paper money, they would be forced to use the notes issued by the Bank of England. No one had anticipated that the colonial governments would be so inventive as to create their own paper money. So in 1751, Great Britain began to pressure the colonies to redeem all of their currency and withdraw from circulation. This they eventually did, and at bargain prices. By then, their fiat money was heavily discounted in the marketplace, and the governments were able to buy back their own currencies for pennies on the dollar. The decree from the British Parliament, although heavily resented by the colonists, turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The paper notes of the Bank of England never did become primary medium of exchange, probably because of their recent bad experience with paper money. The colonists merely brought what few gold and silver coins they had out of hiding and returned to a true commodity money system. At first, the doomsayers predicted that this would spell further ruin for the colonial economy. There isn't enough money, was the all-too-familiar cry. But there was indeed quite enough for, as we've already seen, any amount is sufficient. So tobacco becomes money. There was, in fact, a period which other commodities became accepted as secondary medium of exchange, such as nails, lumber, rice, whiskey filled the monetary void, but tobacco was the most common. Here was a commodity which was in great demand within the colonies and for overseas commerce at intrinsic value. It could not be counterfeited. It could not be divided into almost any denominational. It could be divided into almost any denominational quantity, and its supply could not be increased except for the exertion of labor. In other words, it was regulated by the law of supply and demand, which gave it great stability and value. In many ways, it was an ideal money. It was officially adopted as such by Virginia in 1642, and a few years later by Maryland. It was used unofficially in other colonies as well. So close was the identity of tobacco with money that the previous fiat currency of Jersey, not a tobacco-growing state, displayed a picture of a tobacco leaf on its face, and also carried the inscription, "To counterfeit is death." Tobacco is used in early America as a secondary medium of exchange for about 200 years until the new Constitution declared that money was henceforth the sole prerogative of the federal government. The dun 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 dun. Wait. Primary currency at that juncture, however, was still gold and silver coins, or specie as it was called. And the immediate result of returning to a second monetary unit was rapid recovery from the economic stagnation previously inflicted by the booms and the busts of fiat money. Trade and production rose dramatically, and this in turn attracted an inflow of gold and silver coin from around the world, filling the void that had been created by years of worthless paper. The law of supply and demand was visibly at work for a while. Massachusetts had returned to specie while Rhode Island remained on fiat money. The result was that Newport, which had been the trade center for the West Indies, lost its trade to Boston, and then became an empty port. After the colonies had returned to coin, prices quickly found their natural equilibrium, and then stayed at that point even during the 7 Years' War, the disruption of trade that occurred immediately prior to the Revolution. There is no better example of the fact that economic systems in distress can and do recover rapidly if the government does not interfere with the natural healing process. War brings a return of fiat money. The war for independence brought all of this to a sudden halt. Wars were seldom funded out of the existing treasury, nor are they even done so out of increased taxes. The governments were to levy taxes on their citizens fully adequate to finance the conflict. Then the amount would be so great that many of even its most ardent supporters would lose enthusiasm. By artificially increasing the money supply, however, the real cost is hidden from view. It is still paid, of course, through inflation, a process that few people understand. The American Revolution was no exception. In order to pay the bill for the independence, both the Confederation and the individual states went heavy into the printing business. At the beginning of the war in 1775, the total money supply stood at $12 million. In June of that year, the Continental Congress issued another $2 million. Before the notes were even put into circulation, another $1 million was authorized. By the end of the year, another $3 million in 1776, another $19 million, $13 million in 1777, $64 million in 78, $125 million in 79, and still more. The Continental Army issued its own certificates for the purchase of supplies, totaling $200 million and a total of $425 million in 5 years, on top of the base of $12 million, in an increase of over 3,500%. And in addition to this massive expansion of the money supply on the part of the central government, it must be remembered that these states were doing exactly the same thing. It is estimated that in just 5 years, from 1775 to the end of 79, the total money supply expanded by 5,000%. By contrast, the amount raised in taxes over the 5-year period was inconsequential, amounting only to a few million bucks. So this is very interesting to me because, I guess we are sort of funding a war, but they always use like the vernacular of wartime for COVID. Just print all this money out, and send everybody, $2,000 or whatever it is. They're doing this. We are doing the same thing that these guys did. I imagine it's got to be, I don't know, whatever. Full disclosure, I'm not an economist. So, the heading is "and a massive inflation," because the last heading was "A war brings the return of fiat money and a massive inflation." The first exhilarating effects of this flood of new money was the flush and apparent prosperity, but that was quickly followed by inflation as the self-destruct mechanism began to operate. In 1775, paper Continentals were traded for $1 in gold. In 1777, they were exchanged for 25 cents. By 1779, just 4 years from their issue, they were worth less than a penny. The phrase "not worth a Continental" has its origins in this dismal period. Shoes sold for $5,000 a pair. A suit of clothes cost $1 million. It was that year that George Washington wrote, quote, "A wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provisions," unquote. Even Benjamin Franklin began to see the light. In a mood of sarcasm, he wrote, "This currency, as we manage it, is a wonderful machine. It performs its office when we issue it. It pays and clothes troops and provides victuals and ammunition. And then, when we are obliged to issue a quantity excessive, it pays itself off by depreciation." When speaking of deficit spending, it is common to hear the complaint that we are saddling future generations with the bill for what we enjoy today. Why not let those in the future help pay for what will benefit them also? Don't be deceived. That is a misconception encouraged by politicians to calm the public. When money is fiat, as the colonists discovered, every government building, public work, and cannon of war is paid out of the current labor and current wealth. And these things must be built today with today's labor, and the man who performs the labor must also be paid today. It is true that the interest payments fall partly in future generations, but the initial cost is paid by those in the present. It is paid by loss of value in the monetary unit and the loss of purchasing power for one's wages. Inflation is a hidden tax. Fiat money is the means by which governments obtain instant purchasing power without taxation. But where does the purchasing power come from? Since fiat money has nothing of tangible value to offset it, the government's fiat purchasing power can be obtained only by subtracting it from somewhere else. it is in fact collected from us all through a decline in our purchasing power. It is, therefore, exactly the same as a tax, but one that is hidden from view, silent in operation, and little understood by the taxpayer. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson provided a clear explanation of this process when he wrote, "Everyone through whose hands a bill passed lost on that bill what it lost in value during the time it was in his hands." This was a real tax on him. And in this way, the people of the United States actually contributed those millions of dollars during the war, and by a mode of taxation, the most oppressive of all, because it is the most unequal of all. Enter price controls and legal tender laws. As prices skyrocketed, the colonies exacted wage and price controls, which were like plugging up the whistle on a little tea kettle in hopes of keeping the steam from escaping. When that failed, there followed a series of harsh legal tender laws. One law even evoked the specter of treason, and it said, "If any person shall hereafter be so lost to all virtue and regard for his country as to refuse to receive said bills in payment, he shall be deemed, published, and treated as an enemy in this country, and precluded from all trade and intercourse with the inhabitants of these colonies." Rhode Island not only levied a heavy fine for non-acceptance of its notes, but on a second offense, the individual was stripped of their citizenship. When a court declared an act unconstitutional, the legislator called the judges before it and summarily dismissed the offenders from office. Enter economic chaos and insurrection. The ravages of war were a harsh burden for the colonies to bear. The havoc of fiat money was equally so. After the war, inflation was followed by deflation as reality returned to the marketplace. Prices fell drastically, which was wonderful for those who were buying. But for the merchants who were selling, or the farmers who had borrowed heavily to acquire property at inflated wartime prices, it was a disaster. The new lower prices, were not adequate to sustain their fixed inflated mortgages. And many hardworking families were ruined by foreclosure. Furthermore, most people still did not understand the inflation process. And there were many who continued to advocate the paper money cure. Several of the states were receptive to the pressure, and their printing process continued to roll. Historian Andrew McLaughlin recalls a typical scene in Rhode Island at the time as witnessed by a visiting Frenchman. A French traveler who had passed through Newport about this time gives a dismal picture of the place. Idle men standing with folded arms at the corners of the streets, houses falling into ruin, miserable shops offering for sale nothing but a few coarse stuffs, grass growing in the streets, windows stuffed with rags everywhere, announcing misery. The triumph of paper money and the influence of bad governments. The merchants had closed their stores rather than to take payment in paper. Farmers from neighboring states did not care to bring their produce. Idleness and the economic depression also led to an outburst of rebellion and insurrection. In 1786, George Washington wrote to James Warren, "The wheels of government are clogged, and we are descending into a vale of confusion and darkness." 2 years later, in a letter to Henry Knox, he wrote, "If any person had told me that there would have been such formidable rebellion as exists, I would have thought him a bedlamite." I love it, a bedlamite, a fit subject for a madhouse. Fortunately, there is a happy ending to the part of the story, as we shall see in the subsequent chapter, when the state delegates assembled to draft the Constitution. The effects of fiat money were so fresh in their minds, they decided to put an end to it once and for all. Then the new republic not only rapidly recovered, but also went on to become the economic envy of the world for a while, at least until the lessons had been forgotten by following generations. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, we are dealing with the topic of fiat money and the experience of the American colonies as a classic example of what always happens when men succumb to its siren call. Let us, at this point, observe another one of those lessons derived from centuries of experience. That lesson is so clear and so universal and so widely seen throughout history that it may be stated as a natural law of human behavior. Lesson: fiat money is a paper money without precious metal backing, in which people are required by law to accept. It allows politicians to increase spending without raising taxes. Fiat money is the cause of inflation and the amount to which people lose its purchasing power. It's exactly the amount which is taken from them and transferred to their government by this process. Inflation, therefore, is a hidden tax. This tax is most unfair of all because it falls mostly heavily on those who are least able to pay, the small wage earner and those on fixed incomes. It also punishes the thrifty by eroding the value of their savings. This creates resentment among the people, leading always to political unrest and national disunity. Therefore, this is a natural law proposed. A nation that resorts to the use of fiat money has doomed itself to economic hardship and political disunity. All right, now we're going to talk about fractional money. Understand how these functions, we must return to Europe and the practice of the early goldsmiths who stored the precious metal coin for their customers for a fee. In addition to the goldsmith who stored coins, there was another class of merchants called scriveners who loaned coin. The goldsmiths reasoned that they too could act as scriveners, but to do so with other people's money. They said it was a pity for all that coin just to sit idle in their vaults. Why not lend it out and earn a profit, which they could be split between themselves and the depositors? Put it to work instead of merely gathering dust. They had learned from experience that a very few of their depositors ever wanted to remove their coins at the same time. In fact, net withdrawals seldom exceeded 10 or 15% of their stockpile. It seemed perfectly safe to lend up to 80 or even 85% of their coins, and so the warehouse began to act as loan brokers on behalf of their depositors, and the concept of banking as we know it today was born. That's the way many history books describe it, but there is more involved here than merely putting idle money to work. First of all, sharing the interest income with the owners of the depositors was not part of the original concept. It only became general practice many years later after the depositors became outraged and needed to be reassured that these loans were in their interest as well. In the beginning, they didn't even know that their coins were being loaned out. They naively thought that the goldsmiths were lending out their own money. Deposits are not available for lending. In the second place, we need to consider whether the coins in this vault were even available for lending, regardless of whether or not the depositors received a part of the profit. Let us suppose that we are playing a game of poker at the home of Charles Smith. Each of us had given $20 to Charles, who's acting as the banker, has put our money into a shoebox and given us, in return, 20 poker chips. It is the understanding that anytime we want to go home, we can get $1 back for each chip we have at the time. Now let us suppose that Charlie's brother-in-law, Larry, shows up, not to play poker, but to borrow some money. Since 6 of us are playing and each of us has put $20, there's a total of $120 in the shoebox. And that turns out to be perfect for Larry's needs. You can imagine what would happen if Charlie decided to lend out the idle money and the idle money. It is not available for lending. And neither Charlie nor any of the players have the right to loan those dollars because they are being held in escrow, so to speak. pending completion of the contract between Charlie and his guests. These dollars no longer even exist as money. They have been replaced, in concept at least, by the poker chip. If any of us are so touched by Larry's story that we decide to loan him the money ourselves, we would have to do so with other dollars or cash in our chips for the dollars in the shoebox. In that case, of course, we can no longer stay in the game. We cannot spend, loan, or give away the deposit and so consider these chips to be worth anything. If you are a member of an organization that has given your proxy to a friend to vote in your absence at the annual meeting, you cannot then show up and cast your own vote in addition to your proxy. Likewise, in the beginning of banking, these certificates, which were circulated as money, were, in effect, proxies for the coins. Consequently, these coins were not available for lending. Their monetary value had been assigned to the certificates. If the certificate holders had wanted to lend out their coins, they should have retired their certificates first. They are not entitled to hold spendable paper money, as also authorized their bankers to lend the same money as coins. One cannot spend, loan, or give away the coins and also consider the certificates to be worth anything. All of this is just common sense, but there is another dimension to the problem, which has to do with honesty in business contracts. When the bankers used these coins as a basis for their loans, they were putting themselves in a position of not having enough coin in the vault to make good on their contracts when it came time for the depositor to take their money home. Or in other words, the new contracts were made with the full knowledge that under certain circumstances they would have to be broken. But the bankers never bothered to explain that. The general public was led to believe that if they approved of putting these supposedly idle funds to work, they would be helping the economy and earning a little profit besides. It was an appealing proposal, and the idea caught on like wildfire. Who's to say I haven't done an occult episode in a long time? Look, we're talking about alchemy right here. Most of the borrowers wanted paper money, of course, not bulky coins, so when they received their loans, they usually put the coins right back into the vault for safekeeping. And they were given receipts for these deposits, which, as we observed, were readily accepted in commerce as money. At this point, things began to get real complicated. The original depositors had been given receipts for all of the bank's coins, but the bank now issued loans in the amount of 85% of its deposits. The borrowers were given receipts for that same amount. These were in addition to the original receipts that made up 55%, more receipts than coins. Thus, the banks created 85% more money and placed it into circulation through their borrowers. In other words, by issuing phony receipts, they artificially expanded the money supply. At this point, the certificates were no longer 100% backed by gold. Now they had a backing of 54%, but they were accepted by the unsuspecting public as equal in value to the old receipts. The gold behind all of them, however, now represented only a fraction of their face value. Thus, the receipts became what may be called fractal money. The process by which they were created is called fractional reserve banking. None of this shortfall, unfortunately, was ever explained. The bankers decided that it would be better not to discuss reality where the public could hear. These facts became the arcane secrets of the profession. The depositors were never encouraged to question how the banks can lend their money and still have it on hand to pay back on an instant's notice. Instead, bankers put on great airs of respectability, stability, and accountability, and they dressed and acted serious, if not stern. They erected great artifices resembling government buildings and temples, all to bolster this false image of being able to honor their contracts and to pay on demand. It was John Maynard Keynes who observed, "A sound banker, alas, is not one who foresees danger and avoids it, but one who, when he is ruined in a conventional and orthodox way along with his fellows, so that no one can readily blame him. It is necessarily part of the business of a banker to maintain appearances and to confess a conventional respectability which is more than human. Lifelong practices of this kind make the most romantic and the least realistic of men. Creating money out of debt. Let us step back for a moment and analyze. In the beginning, banks served as warehouses and for the safekeeping of their customers' coins. And when they issue paper receipts for these coins, they converted commodity money into receipt money. This was a great convenience, but it did not alter the money supply. People had a choice of using either coin or paper, but they cannot use both. If they used a coin, the receipt was never issued. If they used the receipt, the coin remained in the vault and did not circulate. When the banks abandoned this practice and began to issue receipts to the borrowers, they became magicians. Some have said they created money out of nothing, but that's not quite true. What they did was even more amazing. They created money out of debt. Obviously, it is easier for people to go into debt than to mine gold. Consequently, money no longer was limited to the natural forces of supply and demand. From that point in history forward, it was to be limited only by the degree to which bankers have been able to push down the gold reserve fraction of their deposits. From this perspective, we can now look back on fractional money and recognize that it is a transitional form between receipt money and fiat money. It has some of the characteristics of both, and a fraction becomes smaller the less it resembles the receipt money and the more it comes to fiat money. When the fraction finally reaches zero, then it has made the complete transition and becomes purely fiat. Furthermore, there is no example in history where men, once they had accepted the concept of fractional money, didn't reduce the fraction lower and lower until it eventually became zero. No bank can stay in business for very long with a zero reserve. The only way to make people accept such worthless currency is by government force. That's what the legal tender laws were all about. The tradition from fractional reserve money to fiat money, therefore, requires the participation of government through a mechanism which is called a central bank. Most of the balance of this book will be devoted to the study of that creature. But for now, suffice it to say that the euphoria of being able to create money without human effort is so great that once such a narcotic is taken, there is no politician or banker who can kick the habit. As William Sumner observed, quote, "A man might as well jump off a precipice intending to stop halfway down," unquote. So this is all, if I understand it correctly, this is all, they kind of standardize this trap, this psychological trap, and now they call it the modern monetary theory. Where you just spend, print, spend, because it doesn't mean anything anyway. However, they still want to raise your fucking taxes all the time. So what's that fucking all about? Once again, we come to one of those natural laws that emerge from centuries of human experience. They can be stated as follows. Fractional money is paper money which is backed by precious metals up to only a portion of the face amount. It is a hybrid, being part receipt money and part fiat money. Generally, the public is unaware of the fact and believes that fractional money can be redeemed in full at any time. When the truth is discovered, as periodically happens, there are runs on the bank and only the first few depositors in line can be paid. Since fractional money earns just as much interest for the bankers as does gold or silver, the temptation is great for them to create as much money as possible. As this happens, the fraction which represents the reserve becomes smaller and smaller until eventually it is reduced to zero. Therefore, fractional money will always degenerate into fiat money, but it is but fiat money in transition. So much for the overview and the generalities. The next chapters, we're probably not going to definitely get definitively into the next chapter. I got to kind of read ahead and scout out a good spot. So, in summary, fiat money is paper money without precious metal backing, which people are required by law to accept. The first record appearance of fiat money is in the 13th century China. But its use on a major scale did not occur until colonial America. The experience was disastrous, leading to massive inflation, unemployment, loss of property, the political unrest during one period when the Bank of England forced the colonies to abandon their fiat money. General prosperity quickly returned. The Revolutionary War brought fiat money back to the colonies with the vengeance and the economic chaos that resulted led to colonial governments to impose price controls and harsh legal tender laws, neither of which were effective. Fractional money is defined as paper money with precious metal backing for part, not all, of its stated value. Was introduced in Europe when goldsmiths began to issue receipts for gold, which they did not have, thus only a fraction of their receipts were redeemable. Fractional money always degenerates into pure fiat money. So I hope you guys are liking these. I'm learning stuff as we're going through here. Like I said, I'm not an economist. If you had an opportunity to look at my bank accounts, you would know that. But with that being said, if you guys are interested in like the prepping stuff that I was talking about before, reach out, let me know. I could throw something together. Maybe, I don't know if everyone else, I don't know. So just let me, how many times can I say no in one screed? I am John Towers, and this is the Abracast. Guys, I hope you're buying a couple extra beans, a couple extra bullets, and a couple extra bandages as we're looking down the barrel of a gun, son of a bitch, getting paid, getting rich.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past. Put your present in context and know your future with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot card deck. Your body is your temple. So let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult themed t-shirts. And other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes. More bonus audio. Additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com.